Hi, you're on the edge with me, Max Kaiser. Yes, it's me, Max Kaiser, and this is On the Edge. Very special show today. I'm going to take you right now to London to talk with Nicole Foss, otherwise known as Stone Lee, of the Automatic Earth blog. Nicole, welcome back to On the Edge.
Thank you for having me, Max.
All right, Nicole, you're well known for your writings on deflation and on resource scarcity, but it is actually nuke safety that is your specialty. Tell us about your background there.
Well, I was a research fellow at the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies. I was their electricity specialist, and my field of research at the time was nuclear safety in Eastern Europe, following on from my master's thesis dissertation that I had done at the University of Warwick previous to that. So I spent about 18 months researching and writing a monograph on nuclear safety in the former Soviet Union and the rest of Eastern Europe. I was particularly looking at Soviet-designed reactors. So
you are obviously an expert in the field, so let's get into some specialized questions here. What is the so-called MOX, M-O-X, plutonium fuel used in Fukushima Unit 3 reactor?
Well, it's a mixed oxide fuel, but all spent fuels are going to have a mixture of different radioisotopes. So I don't think it really makes sense to look at this reactor as if it was radically different from the others. I think you're looking at an enormous mix of radioisotopes, different ones, but I think actually the plutonium that people are concerned about in MOX fuel, I wouldn't regard as by any means the biggest threat to health. I think that would come from iodine-131 and cesium-137, because iodine in particular has a half-life of only 8 days, which means it's very reactive. It's going to be giving off what radiation it gives off in a short period of time, and it is specifically taken up by the thyroid gland. So it targets a particular organ, and then it gives off a lot of energy in a short space of time. So that, I would argue, is the biggest health risk, followed by cesium, which has a half-life of the order of 30 years and persists in the environment and is generally taken up in the body. Plutonium has a half-life of some 24,000 years, and which means it's not giving off an enormous amount of energy at any given time. It is an alpha emitter, so you certainly wouldn't want to ingest it. Alpha particles don't travel very far, but they are quite energetic. So plutonium is of course toxic, but it's not, I would say, the primary health threat at Fukushima.
Nicole, let's review this term half-life again, because it's coming up a lot, and I thought I knew what it meant, but maybe I don't know what it really means. And I didn't know that this half-life, quantification can last from a few days to 20,000 years. Talk to us a little bit about the half-life thing.
Well, the half-life is the period of time that it takes for half of an isotope to decay to something else. So in the case of iodine, in 8 days there'll be half as much as there was, and another 8 days there'll be half again, another 8 days half again. In theory, you never get rid of it altogether, but it goes down drastically. So the radioactive effect of iodine is quite short term, whereas if you have plutonium that has a half-life of some 24,000 years, it will take that long for even half of it to be gone. So it is incredibly persistent in the environment. One of the arguments about, of course, nuclear power and spent fuel in general, with its enormous range of mix of isotopes, is that many of these isotopes are extremely persistent, that they will exist in a radioactive form, concentrated in whatever radioactive waste disposal mechanism that people have come up with, for tens of thousands of years, potentially. And so human societies tend to have a lifespan that has never come close to approaching the amount of time that this waste would be dangerous. And a major issue at Fukushima actually is the spent fuel, because there's a lot more spent fuel than there is fuel in the reactor cores. And that has also experienced at least partial meltdown in at least one case. Now, all the nuclear fuel that has ever been generated by all the reactors in the world is sitting in pools exactly like those ones at at Fukushima. No country has yet designed and implemented a nuclear waste long-term disposal mechanism. They discussed it at Yucca Mountain in the States, but that has not gone ahead. There's one that's being constructed in Finland. That's the first in the world. But we have never come up with a solution for the waste, and as we're finding out now, it's not just the reactors that are potentially the problem. We are storing up an enormous amount of waste in these pools, and then these pools have to have water circulation. You have to keep the fuel rods covered, because it's not just the radioactivity that rods give off that's the issue, it's the heat. As you get radioactive decay of all these different isotopes, they're giving off a lot of heat. They give off more heat at the beginning and cool down over time, but they remain hot for a long time. You would have to leave these rods in these pools for a very long time, years if not decades, before they're cool enough to really take them out and dispose of them in whatever long-term disposal mechanism we eventually come up with. But we have to be able to maintain the cooling for those spent fuel pools for a very, very long time.
All right, let's talk about this spent fuel for a second, because it sounds like what people, so-called terrorists, like to source when they create their dirty bombs. And here you have an irresponsible company in Japan that's, in effect, created a dirty bomb and has attacked its own citizens with their irresponsible behavior. So, politically speaking, there's 2 points here. One is, isn't this the same as a dirty bomb? And number two, what do you make of these reports coming out of the U.S. media that are trying to spin the radiation leak as having, to some degree, a health benefit? I'm talking about, for example, Fox News is running stories saying that there is some health benefits to nuclear radiation. Can you comment on that?
Well, I wouldn't believe anything that I saw on Fox News at all, quite frankly. No, I think it's ridiculous to suggest that there are health benefits from this. It's a matter of spin, and I think that is the irresponsible part. The Japanese company that runs Fukushima arguably has been no more irresponsible than virtually any other nuclear company. And yes, they have occasionally covered up safety records. They're by no means the only ones that have done that. Yes, they store spent fuel in pools with no containment. So does everybody else. So I don't think the company has been unusually irresponsible. Now, from your question about a dirty bomb, so what a dirty bomb would be radioactive material, not enough of it to generate a nuclear explosion, but to have a conventional explosion that spreads radioactive contamination around. You could get something like that in Fukushima if you have a meltdown, which we may or may not actually see. We've had partial meltdowns. I don't think at this point we can say we've had a full meltdown. If we did, and the fuel in the reactor, or one of the spent fuel pools, melted through the floor of either the pool or the containment, melted through the reactor pressure vessel, melted through the concrete containment, it could melt down into the groundwater, you could get a steam explosion, and then, yes, that would spread radioactive contamination around, very much like a dirty bomb. How far that would go and what the health impacts would be would really depend on what kind of wind there was and what direction it was going. So there are a number of factors that will really determine what the health effects are likely to be. My guess is you're going to get an exclusion zone like you have at Chernobyl, where it will not be advisable to live for possibly quite a long time. But I don't think, for instance, that the people who are panicking in Tokyo actually should be panicking. I think the fear radius is significantly larger than the radius of the health effects. And if you look at where Kiev is, for instance, relative to Chernobyl, it's much, much closer to Chernobyl than Tokyo is to Fukushima. It's about half the distance, I believe. But people still live in Kiev, and people will still live in Tokyo. Radiation generates an enormous amount of fear because it's the great unknown. You can't see it. We don't know entirely what the health effects are. But fear is extremely catching. Fear is spreading very widely over this issue. And I think people are panicking prematurely. Now, certainly if I was living in the vicinity of Fukushima, I would leave, and I would not be looking to go back anytime soon, if at all. Certainly within what they currently define as the evacuation zone. But in Tokyo, to me, the risk in Tokyo at the moment is not radiation. It's more to do with cascading system failure as a result of fear. So if people are so afraid that they're rushing to the store and buying up all the supplies on the shelves so there's nothing left, and then you add rolling blackouts in an atmosphere of fear, then Tokyo might not be a nice place to be for a while. But I wouldn't say that it's not a nice place to be specifically because of the radiation. I think the fear of radiation is likely to have larger effects, larger impacts on people's lives than the radiation itself when you look past quite close to the plant.